Stories that you had told were demonstrations of some people who had reflected on a sense of vocation, a caller, having a call upon their lives and then faithfully stewarding it. And my suspicion in any room of followers of Jesus like this, there are probably people who would still have some looming curiosities about their own sense of calling, their own sense of vocation. And so I was curious, from your journeys with people, what are the types of practices that might be most helpful to people in, over time, discerning a sense of calling, listening to the leading of God? Mm-hmm. And what types of practices could also then help them to more meaningfully connect that to the day in, day out existence of their sacred but ordinary lives?
Mm-hmm. So maybe two ways into this. I saw something yesterday where Charles Simeon was quoted. You're a good Anglican these days, Brian. Charles Simeon was a pastor in Cambridge, England for about 50 or 60 years of a church called Holy Trinity. And it's right in the middle of the University of Cambridge, and it's a long story, but he was probably used by God to bring about a renewal of a commitment to live orthodoxy within the Anglican Church in a way that nobody else was in the 19th century and 18th century. But he was asked, so what is the Christian faith? And he said, well, maybe it's three things. It's humility, humility, humility. So I think in some ways, Brian, I would say, any way that we can begin to think about this question of my calling before God in service to the world, it has to be marked by a deep, honest sense of humility. If that's one way in with Charles Simeon, let's take C.S. Lewis as another voice here. Of all the things he has written, and I've loved most of them, I really love a lot the book The Last Battle. It's the last of the stories of Narnia, of course. And if you know the story, there is a last battle, and what will happen afterwards, and we don't know if we don't know the story. But then, of course, there's a new world that is walked into by these kids who've been through the last battle. And they think that maybe they've arrived. Maybe they're here finally, after all the things they've been through. Maybe this is it. And Aslan says to them, no, further up and further in. And they say, okay, we'll follow you further up and further in. They do that for a while, and they think, well, I think maybe this must be it. And he says, no, further up and further in. And I think that's about as good advice as I understand about thinking about all of life, but also what the discovery and unfolding of a calling is about, really. We have some sense, I think I'm not going to be a biologist like my father. I won't be that. I won't be a scientist because I don't like biology, actually. And you have to like biology to be a plant pathologist. What am I going to do with my life then, really? So there was in some ways a discernment, maybe a discipline. Steve, you cannot be like your father, that was imposed upon me as a 14, 15-year-old. I wasn't going to do that. What would I do then? Well, I would say over the next 10, 15 years of my life, slowly taking courses, going places, meeting people, doing more things, reading things, studying this and studying that, I slowly began to have a sense, I think I'm more interested in these things than these things. I care more about these things than I care about those things, actually. But I would say that, over time, I don't meet anybody really, ever, who I would say, would look at me straight in the face and say, I know my vocation, actually. I've got it all settled, thank you. Because if you do, in one sense, you've not been marked by what Simeon argued were the three virtues of the kingdom of Christ: humility, humility, humility. But also maybe you're not in touch with the further up and further in character of always exploring, always discovering, continuing to work at it, and thinking, maybe this is more who I am this year than last year. And maybe if I did this 5 years ago, this isn't quite the same thing anymore for me. I make a distinction between vocation and occupation for this reason. That vocation is the deeper, longer word that makes sense of your life and mine. It's the deeper reality. It's the deeper story that makes sense of who you are, that makes sense of who you are different than your brother and your father and your best friend and your wife and your neighbor. Somebody that is uniquely Brian Gray, and it's not Joel Harris. Good friends as you are, as you were, closely bound together in mind and heart, you're not the same people, really. His things are different than your things. What he cares about are different than things you care about, though in some ways your larger cares are much the same. What you give yourself to day by day are very different in many ways. Occupation is a word that gets at what I do day by day. What relationships and responsibilities do I occupy in the working out of my vocation over the course of my life? So in some ways I would say there's always an evolving relationship between my sense of vocation, my understanding of what my occupation is in this season of my life as I move through my vocation over the course of my life.
One thing that perhaps keeps us as very faithful and well-intended Christians from living lives in this way, and you hinted at it earlier, was a dualistic thinking. And I've heard you speak about this before. What is a dualistic way of thinking amongst Christians? How does it sound? How does it come out, even if pious and well-intended? And why is it so powerful, do you suspect?
Yeah. It's like you, Brian Gray, when you decided, in fact, that being a cardiovascular, heart-interested person as you were as an undergraduate and graduate student, that wasn't quite good enough because it wasn't seminary after all.
Yeah.
If you're going to be more serious about God, what were you going to do with your life? Go to seminary. Now, God in his own strange providence used your years here at Denver Seminary for his good, but your way into it wasn't so well thought through in terms of our conversation tonight. You were thinking out of a more dualistic view of the world and of what God wanted done in the world. It's like this leader of this international ministry to students who said, I think we've been teaching vocation long for 50 years. Can you please help me? Help us? What have they been teaching? Well, if you're most serious about Jesus, join our staff. Not quite so serious, get a secular job and support your friends who are more serious than you. I mean, that story goes on and on and on and on all over the world, really. All over the world it goes on and on.
Why? Why is that so powerful?
I think in some ways, I think sons of Adam, daughters of Eve that we are, we have a disposition to dualism. I think we do. In this broken, wounded world, we have a disposition to separate things out, to divide them up. Rather than the coherence that God intends for us in his world, we make peace with a certain kind of tragic, heartbreaking dualism, which, I have a friend who, people like this live in Denver too, but this guy lives in Arlington, Virginia. We had lunch a few years ago, and he said, Steve, I like to have lunch with you. And I said, I have no idea, Vince. And he said, you think that what I do matters? And I said, well, I do. And he said, I've been part of the church, the parachurch, my whole life. And you know what I am to the church and parachurch? I'm a checkbook. What's his checkbook over? Well, he has patents that are in all your cell phones, just to kind of localize it here. He says, you know what my experience has been for most of my life? I walk into a room and people say, well, thank God he came. Somebody's going to pay for it at least. He's not reluctant and greedy about paying for things. But he says, the church and parachurch has seen me for my whole life for my ability to pay for what the church and the parachurch wants done. I never, ever have a question from anybody, what'd you do to make this money? How is it hard for you this year? What was difficult for you in your life this year? Are you going to keep in business this next year or not, really? Whatever the questions are going to be, he says, I never get asked those questions by anybody but you, And I said, well, I'm interested, actually. It isn't that I'm a glory, because I'm not a glory. I'm just a very ordinary person, really. But that's what dualism looks like.
This has been a long message of many years for you. Yeah. Inherited, even in hearing your stories, inherited rich and helpful and non-dualistic stories of work in the world from your grandfather and your father, but you've been at this for a bit. What helps you to sustain your own hope?
That was part of your question, wasn't it? Yeah.
What helps you to sustain your hope as opposed to becoming cynical?
Yeah.
It's an easy time and place to be a Christian and to be cynical. But you're a hopeful man. And you tell hopeful stories.
Years ago, Chris and I were in a program together on Capitol Hill called the American Studies Program. And I used to give a lecture at the end of the semester to these bright, eager 20-year-olds who came to Washington, D.C. to study for 4 months. And I'd make them think about the difference between hope and optimism. And we used an essay by a man named Stanley Hauerwas, who's a theologian at Duke Divinity School. But it was called Hope versus Optimism, and I wanted the students to think about it in the light of having spent 4 months watching the sausage being made on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. It's Lord Bismarck, who a century and a half ago talked about German politics in this way. He said, if you want to respect sausage or law, then don't watch either being made. You know? That's Washington, D.C. in 2017, isn't it? It's the health care bill this week, of course. It's everything that happens week after week, you know, in Colorado politics and national politics. But it was German politics a century and a half ago for Lord Bismarck, and he said, if you want to respect sausage and law, then don't watch either being made. It'd be easy to imagine if we didn't have a historical view to think that House of Cards invented cynicism. But of course, if you just ask one more question, you think, oh, this was a BBC show first? Huh. Didn't start in Washington, D.C.? Okay. BBC first? England? Huh, that's interesting, really. A generation before this generation? Huh. And you realize, if you think about it, the cynics, capital C, the cynics have been around for thousands of years, literally. Literally, they have. People call themselves, I am a cynic. I belong to the cynics. And hope versus optimism, for me, is really an important distinction, because it says that I'm not optimistic about, you know, my ability to change things tomorrow. That if I work so hard and I'm so smart and I'm so persistent and I'll get this done, and, you know, of course, I live in this strange place called Washington. I don't live in Colorado, after all, though I've always wanted to. But I live in Washington, D.C., where people come from all over the world with the sense that I could change history. I'm smart enough, I'll work hard at it. And then whether it's 3 months or whether it's 3 years, eventually they get cynical. Most of them do, actually. And they either go back to Des Moines and say, I tried Washington, you can't do it there. Or they stay in Washington and they think, cynicism, I know how that works. I'll get mine before you get yours. So to be somebody marked by hope instead, which I would say is a deeply Christian virtue, hope already knows ahead of time that it's a broken world. It isn't surprised by that. It isn't surprised by how hard it turned out to be, actually, because you already knew ahead of time it was a wounded world. So you're not blown off of the horse because, you know, you didn't realize, in fact, that it might run faster than you thought it was going to run. It might turn really hard to the right, or might bump up and down or something. So I think to be molded by, to be shaped by hope is different than optimism, because optimism inevitably, I would say, cycles into pessimism and to cynicism. Yeah. And that's the problem. So you have to be somebody who has, I would say, just to be really concrete about it, Brian, my wife and I have always chosen to live by this credo of the Clapham community in London from 200 years ago. Since we first were married, we made a choice like this. It is not the 11th commandment. It is not what God requires of us. I don't ever see it that way. I think there's some measure of wisdom about it, but we don't always get to live this way, and I acknowledge that to you. We've chosen to live by this credo of the Clapham community of Wilberforce and his friends, to choose a neighbor before you choose a house. To choose a neighbor before you choose a house. And in a city like Washington, D.C., where it's so easy to get lost, because it's such a vast metropolis, so full of people and tribes and traditions and, you know, streets and highways and metros and busy, busy, busy people all day long. So easy to be fragmented in that kind of a world, to be anonymous in that kind of a world. We've always thought it mattered to keep our own vocation alive, our own sense of calling alive, to have people in our lives, not those who share toothbrushes with us, that's not the point here, but people who have some sense of neighborliness together, where we actually could see each other if we needed to talk to each other, week after week and year after year. So that's been a practice that we've lived by for a long time.
I wonder if that's why you got a rope. in the interest of your grandfather's memory. Maybe you chose the same things.
Brian, I have a question from the audience, and it leans in a little more practical direction. But before I ask it, if you have questions, Katie's going to be walking a lap, so get them right in. We want
wave your
questions
hands
for
one
you.
more time.
I said, don't be shy, Katie. Walk boldly through the crowd. So this question leans in more of in a little more practical direction. And the question is, how do you practically translate the heart of vocation into the daily life in the workplace? And I picture maybe somebody that's at a mid-level in their organization where they don't feel like they have significant influence over the mission and shape of a company, or they're not founding their own company, but they're kind of stuck in the middle. Their job may not even be a great fit for them. How do they translate that spirit of wanting to live on mission for the Lord into their daily work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's all going to be different, I would say, for people. But I told different stories tonight. My father was a research scientist. He wasn't the chancellor of the University of California. He wasn't making all the decisions about who got money for this and where it went for that. And he had a certain job to do. He worked with colleagues. There was a university. He was a cog in the machine, you might put it in crude terms that way. He wasn't, in some ways, the person deciding what everything was going to be about. He was given a certain set of questions to work at. I described his life as going off every morning with an honest prayer, God, give me insight into the meaning of my work. Help me to see into the questions that are supposed to be mine today and this year of my life. If I've been thinking about this question for these years, help me to see the connections between that and this in my work, so that I'm not, in some ways, just giving in to the fragmentation and, the compartmentalization of the world in which always seems to have to be this way. The university is always this way. Business is always like this. My friends with Mars, they're not the owners of the Mars Corporation. They're executives, but they're not the owners. They're not the presidents of the divisions. There's a president. Wouldn't you like to be the president of Global Chocolate? Who wouldn't want that job description, really? My friends aren't that. They're not Mr. Mars or anybody. They are people with responsibilities, but they're not the king of the universe either, really. So that's why, for me, that language of can you translate is really important. Because I would say that most of us have to translate. Because you're not the person who can say, well, it will all be this way, my language will be this, it'll be the corporate language, I'll choose the words, I'll choose this, if you want to work here, think like me. But if you're somebody not quite in that position, you're somebody on this position, you're going to have to figure out, well, how do I be faithful to my own convictions before God himself? Be a person of honest and true integrity, not losing myself here, not privatizing my faith for the sake of corporate welfare, of getting on and getting along. But how would you actually argue for things that mattered unless you had some kind of vision of translation, of taking these deepest, truest truths of the universe and finding ways to say, well, how could we within the Mars worlds call this, how about the economics of mutuality? There are 5 words that Mars prizes: efficiency, quality, responsibility, mutuality, something else.
Melts in your mouth, not
Melts
in your hands.
not in your hands.
I think.
But they chose a word that has long history within Mars to draw upon, because it already had resonance within Mars. Now, I would say, as I was explaining to one of you in the break here, that because my friends are Christians, and they really do think biblically, theologically, if you were to press them, they would say, without a blush, our deepest root of our thinking is the Jubilee of God, which never happened in Jewish history. But it was God's hope for his people's life in the world. Well, they're not going to go into the Mars Board of Directors or the Said School of Business at Oxford and say, the Lord has spoken here. They might at some point, but that isn't how they typically could do it, really. They have to find ways to translate. So they've used language which can be made sense of. And I would say that you've got to find ways like that for most of us, because we're not the people who are going to say, it will be, thus saith Brian Gray, and then we all bow down and say, yes, you did say that. Really.
Mercy.
Is that helpful, Joanna?
How would you counsel someone that feels like they're in a vocational mismatch?
Yeah. I mean, they might be, they surely might be. But I would also say this, I mean, in some ways, this is probably an overstatement, Joanna, but I would say I spent much of my life in the Starbuckses of the world with a brown paper napkin, drawing 2 circles on the napkin. Because whether you're 25 or whether you're 55, people I talk to week after week are people who wonder about my life and what I should do with my life. You might think, really, you're asking this question? But in some ways, we're all asking those questions in different ways. And those are a lot of the questions of my life. So I spent my life, I spend way too much money on a chai tea latte, so I own a lot of the brown paper napkins, actually. So I use them liberally, and I put my 2 circles on, one with a V on it, one with an O on it. And the circles overlap, actually, like this. They're not the same circle. There's a bit of an overlap, though. And I say, well, this one's the vocation circle. This one's the occupation circle. And there's a little bit of an overlap between them here. I scribbled between them to say there's an overlap here, but they're not the same circles. That vocation isn't the same word as occupation. It's a different reality. It's a different idea, actually. And that no one I know in the whole world actually has those 2 circles overlapping perfectly. It just isn't a possibility. Why isn't it a possibility? Because you see, we do live in this creation, fall, redemption, consummation story. We live in this already but not yet life in history. So none of us, nobody, you only think they might because it's a fiction. You don't know them well enough. You just haven't talked to them about it. But everybody, everywhere has some sense of tension between what I think I was meant to do, what I really want to do, and what I have to do, what I end up doing. We all have that. And it's making peace with that, which probably is what a holy life looks like. I think all of us long for more coherence. Just to say one thing more about this, because Denver and Colorado is not unlike Phoenix in this way, but it's different, of course, because you're not so close to the Mexican border. But about a couple years ago, if Rob talked about the Surge project here in Denver, this started in Phoenix. And Tyler Johnson, who's the lead pastor for the Redemption Church in Phoenix, called me a couple years ago. He said, Steve, I have a question for you. I said, okay. And he said, you have time? And I said, we can talk about it. And he said, well, I really think this vocation stuff is true. I teach this here in Phoenix. But I've got friends who are pastors in Phoenix who say, it's just pie in the sky, Tyler. You have to go to the university to have a vocation. You know who comes to Phoenix every night? People in the back seats or trunks of cars or trucks, and they get jobs in the backs of restaurants, and they sweep our streets early in the morning, and they get jobs, Tyler. They don't get vocations. And he said, what would you say to this, Steve? Everybody get a vocation? Well, I would have to say on this relation of vocation to occupation that none of us ever have the complete coherence. We just don't. But sometimes because of the grievousness of history, because of economic, social, political troubles in the world, dislocations that happen, sometimes people live with hardly any connection at all between what I think I would want to do, what I think I would love to do, with what I have to do to put bread on the table. And I said to Tyler, who preaches week by week, if you don't preach about that, Tyler, you're missing your own moment as a pastor, of somehow making sure that your congregation hears you talk about the disparity and the dissonance for all of us. And sometimes for people who've come into Phoenix from Mexico 2 nights ago and ended up in your church this weekend.
Okay, here's a fascinating question. How do we influence, or can we influence, those for whom the concept of the common good is nonsensical?
Yeah. And that's more and more the case in America, isn't it? Rarely, often do we have you need to know that in Washington, D.C., I'm officially not a partisan, okay? I vote, but I've long described myself as voting with a torn heart, okay? I believe that the gospel of the kingdom cuts deeper than the partisan divide. I have opinions and votes and hopes and beliefs, but I'm not somebody, even after 30 years in Washington, who you could say, oh, Steve Garber is. Sometimes people say that about me, but then somebody says, oh, he's not either, really. You know? And I like it, especially when somebody says, such a liberal, isn't he? You know what? He's an environmentalist, you know? And somebody says, he's not a liberal. It's okay to be an environmentalist, to be a Christian. Don't you understand that? You know? I mean, it's stuff like that that happens in my city, sadly, really. The common good, we have a harder and harder time finding that language in America. I have a book, I have a few books like this in my library, which actually I've taped and retaped and taped again. One is called Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah and 4 other colleagues at the University of California in the late 1980s. And it was a book looking at Alexis de Tocqueville's visit to America in the early 1800s. He wrote a book called Democracy in America. And the language Habits of the Heart came out of Tocqueville's looking at America. But Bellah and his colleagues in the University of California decided to do a century and a half later looking at who are we and how are we a century and a half later. What are our habits of the heart? They were especially looking at the relationship between the individual and the community. Because Tocqueville's insight was that what marked America in the early 1800s was an unusual in all of history relationship, a healthy ecology being created where there was somehow an honoring of the individual and an honoring of the community at the same time. The individual good and the common good, we could use that language. What Bell and his colleagues concluded was, in the late 1980s, that we were fraying at the seams. This was, of course, 30 plus years ago now. It's even worse today. We can hardly talk to each other. You know, you look at votes made in a place like Washington 10 years ago, 25 years ago, 40 years ago. There's a lot of bipartisan agreement about voting things to get done. Almost never does it happen today. You know, it's almost always an extremely close count. You know, we're going to count the noses very carefully here, because if we don't, we won't get what we want actually. And if it's 8 years ago, you know, we're going to push this through because we can. You know, this year we'll push it through because we can. You know, we don't have to count what you think and what you want, because we're in charge now. It happens every 8 years that way. You know. And no sense, because and then what happens is there's no communal buy-in, because we didn't take other people's hopes and dreams into account. As hard as that is to do that. And it really is hard to do that. But there's no sense of a common weal or a commonwealth or a common good apart from somehow being willing to listen to more than people who think just like you do. As hard as that is in a fragmented society like ours is today.
This will be our last question. When we're asked to discern our sense of calling, what is it we are discerning?
I mean, if the word calling is in relation to these 3 other words, called, call, and caller, then when we use the word calling, we are making a huge assumption about the universe, aren't we? That somebody is able to call. I've been in universities which have been given way too much money by foundations to explore what the idea of vocation means in the 21st century. And as I've talked to the administration and faculty, and I think, okay, how are you going to work this out here? Because you don't even believe in a theistic universe, do you? And they don't, but they sure wanted the millions of dollars that the foundation was willing to give them, you know. And the big debate institutionally was, well, can we talk about calling here if there's no caller? It's hard to do that, really. I mean, it's kind of a scary thing to think about. And maybe metaphysically, morally, an impossibility, I would say. You know, Václav Havel, who was a big teacher to me, was the great playwright in Czechoslovakia who then was imprisoned and then became the president when communism imploded in 1990. But he began to make speeches all over the world, really, about one idea, and there's a whole book full of these speeches on one idea. And the one idea was this: what are the conditions in which human beings have to have in place to act responsibly in the world. Because he knew that for the Czech people who'd been battered and beaten, had been bullied by first the Nazis and the communists, that for 3 generations they had been tyrannized. And by 1990, there was little sense of, we can do anything to change, to affect our future. But Havel, bright man as he was, good man that he was, realized apart from some sense of responsibility for the future, there'd be no future for the Czech people. So he began to ask this question all over the world. What do you have to believe in to be able to get responsibility? And he made this statement out loud in the world. Not as a professor at Denver Seminary, that was not his work, okay? Which wouldn't be a bad thing, but it wasn't what he did. He said, when we lose God in the world, we lose access to 4 great ideas. And the ideas are these. You can't talk any longer then about meaning and purpose and responsibility and accountability. So he says if we're going to say God is gone in the world, which of course is what officially every public high school in Denver teaches, officially the University of Colorado teaches, officially, it is the intellectual, elite, the world we live in. It's what most of what we consume in media believes in. I mean, I'm not a ranter and a raver about very many things, but that's the world we live in today, where there are no windows to transcendence, as Peter Berger described it once. We've closed off the windows to a transcendent universe, officially. So Havel says, okay, if you're going to do that, there's a price tag. And the price tag is, let's stop talking about meaning, purpose, accountability, responsibility, which I would say are 4 words which actually give substance to the very idea of vocation or calling. You can't talk about a calling without talking about those 4 words, actually. So yes, there's something profound and deeply meaningful about realizing that when we speak about calling, we are assuming there's a caller. When we speak about a caller calling us, we are assuming, maybe praying, that we have ears to hear the caller calling us. So a big part of finding one's calling in this world, I would say, is growing the habits of heart, the skills of mind and heart, to be able to discern what is God saying to me, and how does he speak to me? How does he speak to me in the scriptures? How does he speak to me in the church's history? How does he speak to me through my neighbors, through my congregation? Where am I exposing myself in the weeks of my life to God speaking to me, forming, shaping my sense of what my calling is to be in the world? I would say it has to be a multifaceted sense of discerning my calling. But it's fundamentally a belief that there's a caller who loves me and will call me.